The new camp was indeed new. The living barracks, production facilities, kitchen, dining hall, German barracks, fences, towers, gates, everything was made of fresh wood, new, shining. A large plot of land on the edge of the forest, about 150 by 200 meters, was enclosed by a double-high barbed wire fence with 2 towers on 2 diagonally opposite corners. On the left side stood a long residential barrack with 18 rooms. Behind this barrack was a large latrine. On the other side of the huge quadrangle stood the only small building made of concrete blocks. There was a bathhouse and a punishment cell. This building was followed by a kitchen and a large dining hall. This was the living part of the camp, separated from the production part by an inner pillowcase fence with 2 gates. Next to the kitchen, but already in the production part, there was a material storehouse, then carpentry and locksmith workshops. On the right side stood a large barrack, occupied for drafting, and behind it 2 smaller ones. In the first one there was an electrical workshop, and in the second one a graphite workshop. Across the road opposite the camp were built 2 barracks for administration and military guards, and at the edge of the forest stables and warehouses. Half of the rooms in the living barracks had already been occupied by a group of prisoners who had arrived a few days earlier. In the first room there were only 2 residents, the new Russian commandant Colonel Rodionov and his assistant Major Antonov sent from Hammelburg. In the second room they put me with my whole group, then Afanasiev with his men, then Melnikov. The fourth room was almost empty. The next ones were occupied by workers from the workshops, and the last one was occupied by the sanitary unit. Work began from the very first days. The drafting room was equipped with the latest technology, so it seemed to all the engineers, who were used to work on ordinary drawing boards with razors and angles. In a huge barracks divided into the bottom of the room, there were more than 80 drawing machines Kuhlmann with tables rotating at any angle and 2 scale rulers, at right angles mounted on a special movable dividing head. I was again placed in a small room with a wide window to the general hall. After a week of work, the general picture of the organization and functions of the Stalag 2C work camp began to emerge. Arbeitskommando Wolgast, here installed Peenemünde. There were 5 workshops in the camp. The first and largest, both in terms of number of people and size of the building, was the drafting shop. Organizationally, the drawing shop was divided into 2 independent departments. 1. Bureau Vorrichtungen Bureau of Adaptations, which was run by an engineer from the Darmstadt Higher Technical School, Pellet, and 2. Technisches Bureau, the technical bureau under the direction of Professor Jenik of the Stuttgart Polytechnic Institute. Both were in military uniform and both were non-commissioned officers, but apart from the uniform and the military rank there was nothing about them. Typical representatives of a higher technical school. Peppert was younger and more aggressive. Jenika was well into his 50s and was a quiet, even somewhat lethargic and apparently sickly man. Pellet, if he was not a Nazi, he pretended to be one. Whenever he met other Germans, he clicked his heels, extended his arm, and bellowed bravely, "Heil Hitler." Janicki almost did not hide his negative attitude to everything around him, and instead of the established Nazi greeting, sluggishly, reluctantly raised his right hand palm forward and said nothing. In the fixture bureau, sometimes quite complex devices and fixtures for mass production, turning, milling, welding, etc., were drawn from sketches brought in by Pellet. The technical bureau worked according to a strange system of squares, apparently ensuring secrecy. The task for each draftsman was given on a separate piece of paper in the form of a sketch, where the coordinates in space of some tubes, electrical cables and parts of metal structures, etc., were indicated, with a general indication that here should be installed such and such a mechanism. Usually it was a solenoid, a servo motor or a mechanically, or electrically operated valve. Everyone received assignments completely different on different scales from different people. In spite of all efforts, even the most competent engineers with great production and design experience could not find out the general picture. I, to whom all the finished products flowed, sometimes sat for hours over these drawings, trying to understand their interrelation or to get at least a remote hint of what these units could be used for, but alas, without any success. The second by the number of people working was the electrical workshop. It was headed by a young, quick-footed, non-commissioned officer with an amputated left arm engineer Keeler, or simply Franz, as everyone called him. There they assembled individual panels, consoles, and so on. Almost all of these schemes often involved some kind of box, hermetically sealed with the contacts taken out. The electricians had little idea what they were doing either. The next workshop was a graphite workshop. The head of it was an elderly, enormously tall German in civilian clothes, Herr Peritner. Silent, always gloomy, but calm and even friendly. There, from graphite powder and sticky, foul-smelling liquid were moulded blades, very streamlined type, and then these blades in special furnaces were subjected to heat treatment. In the locksmith's shop, frameworks for the electrician's panels and levers with fixtures for the graphite shop were made. Finally, in the carpentry shop, packing cases were made for the electrician's products and graphite paddles. Russian Commandant Colonel Stepan Davidovich Ogorinov did nothing but read all his free time during the day when everyone was at work, for there were plenty of books and the library was in his room. After work the preferencists would come to him and the polka would last until bedtime. All the work in the camp was conducted by the Assistant Commandant Major Vladimir Yakovlevich Antonov, an attentive, intelligent and balanced man who could get along with the motley mass of prisoners and with the Germans. He knew German well, so there was no interpreter in the camp. There was no need for interpreters at all. Almost all the prisoners could already communicate with the Germans themselves. Some better, some worse. Even I could talk to my superiors myself. I understood them almost completely, and if they sometimes found it difficult to understand me, there was always Melnikov or another of the specialists, who already knew German well enough. The whole huge blueprint barracks was divided into 2 halls. At the entrance to the barracks, 2 small rooms were arranged. One was reserved for the drawing superintendent, where there was my desk, cabinets with materials, i.e., paper, drawing supplies, finished drawings and everything else. The other room, on the right side of the entrance, was filled with spare furniture and unused drafting machines. There were 2 rooms at the other end of the barracks, too. German engineers worked there, a married couple, both in military uniform and an elderly German in civilian clothes, and with a Bavarian hat on his head. He did not remove his hat, even while working at his desk, only sliding it slightly to the back of his head. It was forbidden to enter the rooms of the Germans, and no one knew what they did there during the working day, but judging from the fact that the couple always had a gramophone playing and laughter and loud conversations, they did not work there very intensively. He, tall, handsome and young, was noted for his virtuoso bicycle riding. Without touching the handlebars, on an uneven dirt track, from the drawing room across the yard and road to the German barracks, he would bring a tray with glasses full of tea or coffee without spilling the contents, and was apparently proud of his artifice himself. She, a beautifully built, also tall and pretty brown hair, tightened the shape of her bulging breasts and ass to the limit of the possible and liked to go through the drawing, swaying her hips and jiggling her breasts, under the greedy gazes of 50 young men who had not touched a woman's body for more than a year. Apparently these undressing gazes gave her sensual pleasure. It is true that when she was not walking alone, but accompanied by her husband or another German, she behaved more modestly. But when she walked alone, everyone watched her every movement. And she walked with a smile on her swarthy and somewhat vicious face, and evidently regretted only that she did not understand the words of these hungry men. There are all sorts of pleasures to be had. A family came to see Commandant Radatz. It was strange to see that the nervous, irascible, and often violent Radatz could be such a gentle, loving and attentive father and husband. His wife was a chubby, blue-eyed maiden, and his 2 little daughters looked like Easter angels on a postcard. The older one was 3 or 4 years old, and the younger one not more than a year and a half. Radatz spent his days with these girls, making toys for them, picking flowers with them, riding them on his bicycle. He got 2 small kittens somewhere, and his daughters never parted with the fluffy, affectionate animals. On the 3rd day of the Radatz family's arrival, one of the prisoner workers in the locksmith's shop was caught by the foreman stealing. He stole a pack of tobacco and a large folding knife from the foreman's office and wanted to take his loot to the living quarters during the lunch break. The foreman somehow caught him red-handed and called Radatz. All the prisoners were detained at the gate to the housing block. The foreman of the locksmith shop was holding the short locksmith Nishinitz by the scruff of his shirt, occasionally slapping him with his free hand. The material evidence was lying here, on the ground, at the feet of the thief. The beggar smiled weakly and confusedly, flinching at each new blow. Radatz came running. The foreman told him what had happened, and, letting Nishinitz out of his arms, pushed him towards Radatz. He met the wretched man with a hail of blows. He whipped him on the head, on the shoulders, on the hands with which he wanted to protect his face, becoming more and more agitated and excited. Nishinitz fell, and Radatz began to kick the fallen man. The prisoners became agitated. This beating was already going too far. Colonel Ogarinov, Major Antonov, myself and a few others left the ranks and approached Radatz, demanding that he stop the beating. Radatz, all red, with eyes narrow with rage, retreated a couple of steps and took his pistol out of his holster. It's hard to imagine how this could have ended. In such a frenzy, Radatz could have used a gun. But chance helped. A soldier came running from the camp gate across the courtyard and said something to Radatz. Those standing closer realized that there was some misfortune in Radatz's family. The lieutenant suddenly turned pale and, dropping his stack on the ground, rushed to the exit. The beaten Nishinitz was taken to the sanitary unit, and I went to the room to get the forgotten spoon. Coming to the room, I saw a picture, which I could not forget for a long time. On the road, between the camp fence and the German barracks, Radatz was sitting, holding the corpse of a crushed kitten in his arms. His wife was standing next to him, holding his youngest daughter in her arms. The wife was crying and the little girl was choking and crying. Radatz, with one hand, embraced the sobbing eldest girl, who had tucked her face into her father's shoulder, and with the other hand stroked the killed kitten lying on his lap, and he himself was also crying. Several Germans were standing nearby, shaking their heads and sighing sorrowfully. I stood, looked and thought, "Oh Lord, your ways are inscrutable." A split personality, or the astronomical meanness of this son of a bitch beaten to a pulp by a beggar and a kitten. The foam of rage on the lips of the Feldfeld and tears of sincere grief in the eyes of a loving father. Fetzer, who had not been seen for the last 2 weeks, reappeared. He came to the drawing room, walked between the tables, chatted with the prisoners, and then looked in on me. "How's life at the housewarming party? As of tomorrow, I'm moving in here too. And tomorrow a new commandant will arrive at the camp to replace Radatz. Oberfeldwebel Hildenbrandt, an Austrian, a very cultured man, a servant, but conscientious and fair. In Vienna he has a large business in the artistic decoration of theatres, palaces, mansions and the like. He is the 3rd generation of the firm's owners and is a rich man. But that's just for the record. Here's my point from the first day of this new camp. The ANR pays money to all prisoners working in the camps, included in the ANR system. The maximum payment is 1 mark per day, the minimum 58 Piepfennigs. The money will be given out once a month, and the prisoners will be able to spend it in a cantina that will come here every 2 weeks. There they will sell all sorts of little things: haberdashery, cigarettes, playing cards, some writing materials, perhaps candy, and all sorts of such nonsense. The money, of course, will be special, not government money. I will announce it tomorrow at the morning inspection, and for clerical work, compiling statements, filing and other bookkeeping, I appoint you according to Fetzer. This choice had received public approval. He had already had time to talk to Ogarinov, Antonov, and the foreman of all the other workshops. Everyone is pointing to you. After the potato battle you enjoy unshakable authority. From that day, on 5 or 6 evenings a month, I began to work in Fetzer's room, going there immediately after drawing. On these days I was given a soldier's dinner from the German kitchen. The work was trifling. I quickly got used to it. The new commandant, Oberfeldwebel Hildenbrandt, was a tall, thin man of about 60, very calm, composed, benevolent and caring in appearance. He immediately organized a repair shop, where they mended clothes, linen and shoes for the prisoners. The bath now worked 4 times a week, also the laundry. Medical examinations were conducted, and the sick were taken once a week to a doctor in the city. Hildenbrandt also organized visits to the dentist. I took advantage of this and went to the dentist who pulled out the roots of the teeth broken by the police in Zamosk and put a stainless steel bridge on them. I was very pleased to be able to smile again. At the end of the month, Fetzer told me to come to work in his room in the morning and Sunday, because on Monday I had to take the payrolls to Peenemünde. I came immediately after the check. Fetzer was still in bed behind the curtain that divided his room into living and office halves. I began to work, and Fetzer spent a long time behind the curtain shaving and dressing. Fetzer now wore a military uniform with green piping, patches and epaulettes, and was in the rank of Oberleutnant. When he had finished his toilet and was going to the dining room to have breakfast, he asked me to tidy up the room, as he was expecting an officer from Peenemünde. I cleaned the tables, even swept away the dust and drew the curtain. Because Fetzer had left his bed untidy, his things were scattered, and the basin was full of water after washing and shaving, and sat down to work again. An hour later Fetzer returned, looked behind the curtain, and suddenly said indignantly, "I told you to clean it up." It was quite evident that Fetzer intended to make of me not only a clerical clerk, but also his valet. I got up, stacked the papers on the desk, and walked to the door. "I have agreed to work in the clerk's office for the position of your footman or valet. Look for someone else. It is not in the rank of a senior lieutenant in the German army to have a valet in the rank of major in any army, including the Soviet army. Even your field marshals use non-commissioned officers or soldiers for that purpose." "Permission to go," I said. With this conversation defined our relationship with Fetzer. I continued to work in his office, but never again did he try to use me as a servant. The relationship was a strange one. Often, after finishing my work in the Chancery, I would stay in his room for several hours, and he and I would argue on a wide variety of subjects. In private with me, he would gladly expand the topics of debate to the most acute questions: the philosophy of National Socialism as a counterweight to communism and capitalism, racial theory and attitudes toward Jewry, religion, morality, the structure of society, etc. He was a Kazan student in spirit, and liked to argue crossing pikes in verbal duels with a worthy opponent, and since in the atmosphere of Nazi official unanimity, arguments were as impossible as in our Soviet unanimity, I turned out to be a psychological outlet for him, especially since to a certain extent I was a Kazan student myself. One day in March, Fetzer asked me what I thought about General Vlasov and the Russian liberation movement. And when I replied that the name of Vlasov was unknown to me, he said, "I think you should familiarize yourself with the ideas of this man. Talk to Ogarinov, and I will get some literature for you." After talking with my buddies, Bedritsky, Lyashenko, and Rodionov, I went with them to Colonel Ogarinov, and he told us about General Andrei Vlasov. Vlasov, a lieutenant general, was considered the savior of Moscow. He commanded the 20th Army and organized a counterattack on the Germans that led to their retreat from Moscow. Then he was appointed by Stalin as deputy commander of the Northeastern Front, but somehow the Germans managed to defeat this section, and Vlasov was taken prisoner by the Germans in July 1942. Even earlier, in Hammelburg, our captured generals had different assessments of events and differently defined the future role and goals of the entire mass of prisoners. The basic question was, who is enemy no? One? For some the enemy no. One was Hitler, for others Stalin, and for others both Hitler and Stalin at the same time. For Karbyshev the enemy no. One was Hitler. For Lukin, Stalin and Hitler did not differ from each other, but for generals Trukhin, Zhelenkov, Melishkin, and others no. One was put on Stalin's chest. Now General Vlasov also believes that now Russia has a historic opportunity to do away with Stalin, taking advantage of the Germans as a military ally and supplier of everything necessary for the creation of the Russian Liberation Army. Vlasov and his associates are convinced that Russia is too large and potentially strong to fear being enslaved by a post-war victorious Germany. Recently, of course, while still under full German control, a center for the Russian liberation movement has been organized and work has begun on the creation of armed formations of the same name, or ROO. This center is now negotiating with the military organizations of the White Emigration, the Cossacks, Russian Corps in Yugoslavia, Ukrainian nationalists, representatives of Caucasian nationalities, Belarusians, etc., with the aim of creating a united anti-communist front of all peoples inhabiting the Soviet Union. Some believe that behind all these names there is a potential human reserve to create a really large army, but of course the main influx of soldiers and officers is expected to come from the POW camps. The Germans will be releasing volunteers from captivity to the Roa. Rodionov warned that, according to the information he had, we could soon expect the arrival of propagandists from the centre in all camps, including ours in Wolgast, who would be engaged in explaining Vlasov's ideas and recruiting volunteers for the Roa. Soon we began to receive from Stalag the newspaper Zarya, published by the Organization Movement for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, and the camp became as excited as a swarm of bees. Immediately they were loudly speaking for or against, but the majority was still silently and cautiously digesting this news in themselves. I, too, gave serious thought to this news. At any rate, it was one, and probably easily found, way out of the deadlock of captivity, at the end of which only the NKVD was otherwise foreseen. Besides, it seemed to me that, under all circumstances, enemy no. One was Stalin and the Soviet system. With every new issue of the newspaper Zarya, with every new rumour or report about the situation on the war fronts, everyone began to realise more and more clearly that the time was approaching when an independent and very serious decision had to be made what to do when the war came to an end. Outwardly everything continued as before. Almost 300 prisoners worked in their workshops, lived behind wire fences under guard, but somehow they got out of the state of complete isolation from the outside world, and as if joined what was being done in the world, on the other side of the wire. In the first days of June, a new drama played out in the camp. Every day, according to lists drawn up in advance in the drawing room. As in all other workshops, after the work was finished, someone was left to clean the room. On this day, 2 of the 4 cleaners asked to be replaced, which was often the case. The other 2 volunteered, the job was over, everyone left, and the janitors went about their business. Usually after an hour and a half or 2 hours, the cleaners returned to the housing block. No one in the camp noticed that the cleaners did not return on time. A general check was made in the morning, before work, and in the evenings, before lights out. When the guards locked the rooms, the head of the room was to check that everything was in place. That evening, I alone worked late in Fetzer's office, as Fetzer himself had gone to Peenemünde. On such occasions I returned to our barracks at the end of my evening work, accompanied by one of the soldiers of the guard, who unlocked the room and let me in. At about 9 o'clock in the evening, when the sound of blows on a section of rail heralded the departure, there was a commotion in the German barracks, and 2 soldiers literally rushed into the room where I was working and ordered me to follow them. The whole camp was illuminated by searchlights from watchtowers, and the entire population was lined up in front of the living barracks, surrounded by guards. I was ordered to get in line as well. None of the German camp commanders were in sight. The following happened: all 4 cleaners turned out to be residents of Melnikov's room, and at the time of debarkation they were not there. While we were standing in front of the barracks, 2 cars full of soldiers drove up from Wolgast. The soldiers cordoned off the camp. We could see that Hildenbrandt, Valura and several others entered the drawing room and then walked around it with lanterns. One of the guard soldiers came and took Zero Garanov, Antonov, Melnikov and me to the German barracks. The rest of us continued to stand in the yard under the beams of the searchlights. In the room of the camp office, the 4 of us began to be interrogated one by one. The whole picture became clear. One side of the drawing faced the camp fence, between the barrack wall and the fence. The distance was no more than 3 meters, and all this space was overgrown with tall weeds. Just beyond the fence was a field of wheat that was already quite tall and beginning to sprout. 4 cleaners opened a window and, taking advantage of the dusk, the weeds and the inattention of the guard on the tower, cut the bottom 2 rows of barbed wire and slipped into the field. Beyond this field was a swamp, a thicket of bushes, and then, at a distance of half a kilometre, began an area of solid marshes extending to the seacoast. The interrogation was led by one of the 2 Germans in civilian clothes who had come from the city. Our daddy, as Oberfeldwebel Hildenbrandt was called in the camp, sat frowning like a cloud, asking almost no questions. Ogarinov and Antonov were released very quickly and taken back to the camp, but Melnikov and I, separately or both together, were interrogated long and persistently. The interrogators were mainly interested in the fact that all 4 fugitives were from Melnikov's room, and that I had allowed the duty officers to be changed, with the result that all 4 were together in the cleaning of the blueprint. During the interrogation came Feter, who had obviously been summoned to the camp, and an Oberleutnant from Peenemünde von Brunte, the Wehrmacht representative in charge of all work teams of prisoners of war in the ANR. Feter behaved quite correctly and politely during the interrogation, but von Brunte shouted, swore, promised all kinds of punishments and penalties to Melnikov and me, and to the whole camp. Only after 12 o'clock at night, evidently fully convinced of our and Melnikov's non-involvement in the escape or in the preparation for it, we were taken to the living barracks. The night passed restlessly. The barracks was guarded by a reinforced detachment of soldiers. They walked under the windows, talking loudly. Cars often passed by on the road. Shouts and barking dogs were heard. An airplane flew over the camp several times. At dawn again, the whole camp was built in front of the barracks, and we stood like that, surrounded by a reinforced detachment of guards, until almost 9 o'clock. Then 3 cars appeared on the road, from the coast side, and they drove slowly along the fence. On the second car, with its sides down, lay the bodies of 2 of our fugitives who had been killed, and over them, bound and bloodied, stood the other 2. After this spectacle, we were ordered to disperse to the workshops for work. Before the end of the day, Feter appeared in the drawing room. He gathered all of us and told us how all 4 of us had been caught. They had managed to get quite far away during the night through the swamps, but apparently lost their orientation and by morning were back in the immediate vicinity of the camp. They were detected from an airplane von Brunte and ordered to fire on them. The fugitives scattered in all directions and then began the hunt for them, each one separately. 2 were shot, 2 were wounded and in addition beaten. When Sharupov and Cherpovets tried to escape, I warned you all that in your situation it was almost certain death. Feter said. He was asked if von Brunte would have given the order to fire if they had been Frenchmen or prisoners of other nationalities, and he replied, probably not. You have obviously already realized the point yourself. Your names are not on the lists of the International Red Cross, and Germany is not responsible for preserving your lives. I would say that Oberleutnant von Brunte was hasty. Of course, it was possible to catch all 4 alive, but in this case it was up to him. Those who survived will not return to the camp. They will either be executed or placed in a special regime camp. Here the order will be stricter, your trips to work with the Boers will be stopped, and the food will be worse. Blame it on those stupid boys. Strict orders were imposed the same day, inspection in the morning and evening in strictness, departure at 8.30, meals at the standard rate. A wide path was cleared around the whole camp. A patrol of 3 soldiers went around the whole area. The Pope became formidable and official. Visits to the doctor and dentist ceased. From the beginning of the summer, formerly rare air attacks on Germany began first to become more frequent, and then turned into an almost daily occurrence. Usually the attacking squadrons of bombers appeared from the north. From the sea, they flew at enormous altitudes in large formations of many dozens of airplanes, leaving behind them white streams of condensed air. They were met with a hurricane from the anti-aircraft artillery installed along the coast, and the whole sky was covered with clouds of bursts. The attackers flew under cover of light fighters, and when they were met by German Messerschmitts, air battles were played out in the air. It was said that the American Air Force usually attacked during the day and the British Air Force at night. In the camp, the entire length of the living barracks dug a zigzag deep trench, and at the sound of the air alarm, everyone had to take cover in this gap. We knew about the complete defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad and the death of Paulus' army. We knew that in fact now the Germans had switched to a defence strategy and were retreating along the entire front line under the ever-increasing onslaught of the Red Army. Russian front was now the Germans' symbol of extreme tension, punishment for the guilty, condemnation to certain death. Even among our German superiors, including Feter, felt confusion and uncertainty. The German command was now already considering the possibility of landing an amphibious assault somewhere in Italy, France or Norway. 2 failed attempts to escape from our camp. Fetzer's words and the systematic failures of the Germans on all fronts made the subject of escape a very hot topic among the prisoners for some time. After all, it was certainly possible to organize an escape from our camp, and even with forethought and caution, to hope for success. The main question was where to and why. Everyone among us knew that if anyone, a single person or a small group of escapees, had managed to reach the front lines of the Soviet troops, no one would have received them as heroes. They would have been arrested, probably tortured in interrogations with hand-to-hand abuse, and they, mutilated and dishonored, would have ended their lives in the concentration camps of Siberia. Many knew this well from the experience of the Finnish War. However, when the Allies captured some part of the mainland, and no one doubted the close probability of this, they would be received there as heroes, but would be handed over to Soviet representatives, and the result would be the same knocked-out teeth, broken ribs, and the same Siberian concentration camp, but with the additional charge of being a spy. There was nowhere to go and no reason to run. The only point of escape was to somehow get lost in Europe, take refuge until the end of the war, and then try to find his place in the post-war situation. But that would require outside help and a safe place to hide indefinitely. This was pure theory. This pessimistic assessment of our possibilities and the results of a successful escape was compounded by the fact that our camp had more than 80% of the Kommsomstview. What could sometimes be forgiven to a private did not apply to a commander. This is also from the experience of the Finnish War. Escape for the sake of escape, of a purely adventurous order, few could be attracted because it would be foolishness and a pointless risk. The rower began to be mentioned more and more often as a possible way out. There is at least some hope there, if the matter grows to the necessary scale, and besides, for peace and death is red, especially if one's life is given for a just cause. Some people had already made such a conclusion for themselves, and were not ashamed to express it in conversations. There were 3 new engineers in the drafting room. Soviet engineers. 2 occupied the room where the warehouse was, against mine, and the 3rd worked in the room of the German in the Bavarian hat. Janiki said they were Russian rocket engineers, and that they had volunteered to work for the Germans. All 3 were dressed in soldiers' uniforms, without any insignia. 2 lived in the city and came every morning on bicycles, and the 3rd was given a room in a German barracks, next to Fetzer's room. Before the war, these engineers had worked on the design and testing of the Red Army's famous Katyusha rocket weapon. Those who lived in Wolgast were clearly shunned by the prisoners, reluctant to enter into conversations and try to avoid them. But the one who settled in the German barracks, on the contrary, was very sociable, often came to the drawing room or to my room. His name was Semyon Vladimirovich, or simply Senya. He was, as they call it, a motor Perubok, swarthy, agile, probably a little younger than me, cheerful, cunning and secretive, if the conversation was about his work in the present and the past. Once he told me that he was a street kid. From the age of 7 to 15 he had been hanging around the SS. It was strictly forbidden to enter their room, as well as the rooms of other Germans working at the drawing office. In the evenings, when I was working in Fetzer's room, he would drop in to disturb me, as he used to say. I tried to find out from him what they were doing in Peenemünde and what he and his colleagues were doing here, but he told me bluntly, "Don't ask. I can't answer anyway." He quickly established an acquaintance outside the camp with a group of girls from Ukraine working for a neighbouring rich bower, and often disappeared there in the evenings. Sometimes he would bring me a bottle of beer. The girls stole it from the owner, especially for you. There's a girl from Kiev who sends her regards to her countryman at this bower. His name was Herr Frohlich. Our brigades from the camp were always working, and I visited him a couple of times. Among the other boers with whom our brigades worked, Frohlich was famous for feeding the prisoners very well. One evening Senya said to me, "Tomorrow you will have in your camp very big bosses from Peenemünde and from Berlin. There will be a great spectacle. There will be Herr Braun himself, the chief of the chiefs in Peenemünde." Before I left, Fetzer, who had come from the ANR administration, also appeared and confirmed Sini's words. Tomorrow the ANR leadership will show our camp to some persons of very high position in the government. In the morning the rising was done an hour earlier, at 5:30 a.m., and immediately everyone was put to work cleaning and tidying the camp living quarters and workshops. The camp was simply flooded with Germans in uniform and in civilian clothes. When we were cleaning the yard, several military trucks came to the camp. They brought a whole military unit, at least 1,500 soldiers, and what a lot of them. All were well uniformed, all with automatic rifles, all young and all with SS badges. The arriving soldiers replaced our permanent guards at all posts, on the towers, on the perimeter of the camp, and inside it. Even at the door of each workshop sentries were posted. On the road, these visiting soldiers had placed barbed wire slingshots they had brought with them, and even at the edge of the forest their patrols were visible. Such unusual measures prompted the speculation Hitler himself must be coming. The distinguished guests were due to arrive by 10 o'clock in the morning. At 9:30 all preparations were finished and everyone took their workplaces. All the Germans were obviously worried. Even phlegmatic Geneik walked on the drawing, nervously rubbing his hands and all the time looking at the courtyard through the windows. Exactly at 10:00, a whole caravan of limousines drove up to the camp. In front and behind rode squads of military motorcyclists. All the Germans from the draft and 3 Russian engineers lined up in a row at the entrance to the barracks. I had a good view of the whole ceremony of receiving the superiors from the window of the room. When the newcomers got out of their limousines, they were met by a forest of hands raised in fascist greeting. Among the greeters I saw Michael, who had disappeared from the camp shortly after we moved here from Wolgast. The whole group of newcomers passed through the gate. The soldiers took guard. In front, in a row, walked 5 men. Geneik, back in the drawing room, told me who they were. A young, tall man and a light grey suit, with uncovered head, was the engineer. Werner von Braun, the chief scientific director and head of the laboratories of the ANR. The man in naval uniform was Admiral Dinitz. Next to him walked Field Marshal Kleist, talking with General Dornberg, the chief administrator of the ANR. And the man in military uniform on the other side of the admiral was none other than Albert Speer himself, the Minister of Armaments of Germany. The entire group of newcomers, led by these 5, walked through the entire camp. They examined the dwelling barracks, the kitchen, the canteen, the locksmith and carpenter workshops, very cursorily, without lingering, but at the graphite workshop. After examining it, they stood in the yard, discussing something. Through the electrical workshop they again passed quickly, and at last all the superiors came to our barracks. Apparently they were interested in where the escape had taken place a month ago. They went around the barracks and Oberleutnant von Brunti showed where it had happened. Only Braun, Speer and Kleist entered the drawing room, while Dornberg and Dinitz remained in the courtyard. Braun shook hands with Geneik, nodded his head to Pellert, and walked slowly down the length of the middle aisle to the back doors. Here he stopped and began to joke with a busty German woman. Then he, Speer and Kleist went into the room of the German in the Bavarian hat and talked in his room for about 10 minutes. All 3 of them came out laughing and walked with quick steps back to the main entrance. Only here Braun turned to the prisoners standing at their desks and said loudly something like goodbye, waved his hand, and went out into the courtyard. Neither Speer nor Kleist dignified us with their attention. It was as if they had taken us as an addition to the furniture, and that was all. All the superiors were in the camp for no more than 40 minutes. All the newcomers got into their limousines and, accompanied by a forest of tensely raised hands, drove away. After another half hour and all the SS men who had arrived got into their trucks and also disappeared in a cloud of dust. The life of the camp returned to its usual course. But we, the prisoner engineers, were impressed by the visit of such a high-ranking person, by the very fact of the visit. If they came, even for 40 minutes, to this camp, it means that this place is important, and if so, why? What are we doing? What does our camp exist for? Until the visit of the big bosses, most of the prisoners in the camp had given little thought to this question, what are we doing, and somehow subconsciously tried to minimize the importance of the ANR in the German war industry. Even myself and my closest comrades, looking at our work, could not see anything serious. The drawings that were made in Peldert's group were the simplest representations of devices for mass production of parts on lathes or milling machines, or for electric welding. There was nothing secret, special, or important about them. Such drawings could be made by draftsmen of the most ordinary level from sketches received from Peenemünde. The drawings produced under the direction of Prof. Janicki were certainly not intended for the production of what they depicted. They were most likely illustrations for some technical books, textbooks, or perhaps manuals. That had reassured us. But now we began to perceive differently the familiar sight of long shells, like small airplanes flying out of Peenemünde over the forest, roaring and rumbling upwards and disappearing into the sky. It was becoming quite clear that while the production of the blueprint had an indirect relation to these projectiles, the production of the graphite and electrical workshops was the direct manufacture of parts for them. I began to question Semyon, Fetzer, and Janicki cautiously in order to get a clearer picture of what was being done by Peenemünde, into whose system we had fallen by fate. Seaman was again reluctant to speak to me on these subjects. "I've already told you once, don't ask me to answer, I can't. Understand my situation too, I never got more out of him." When one evening, while working in Fetzer's room, I asked him, as if by chance, a question about what NAR was manufacturing, he replied very sharply, "None of your business. You and I can rant on any topic we want. But the topics and their depth are determined by me. The topic of Peenemünde is not on the list. I think you are intelligent enough to realize that. Besides, your curiosity could be misunderstood, and that could bring a lot of trouble, but Janicki proved to be more wordy and frank. I, with Karl Janicki, professor of theoretical mechanics at the University of Stuttgart, established very good, just friendly relations from the very beginning of our acquaintance. He was much older than me, almost 20 years, tall, fat, grey-haired, with a flabby, wrinkled face, a large nose and strikingly blue, clear, childishly kind eyes. He often sat in my room and read books, usually philosophical, and sometimes the Bible. I asked him the same question, what products do the NAR plants produce? And Janicki simply said, those noisy little airplanes you see and hear almost every day. Then he sighed and added official Germany praise for victory and for the success of the work at Peenemünde, and we, unofficial but basic Germany, pray to God to send us peace. The name of these rocket projectiles, Vergeltumswaffe, speaks for itself. But I advise you not to ask anyone such questions and to forget at once what old Janicki told you. Thus at last the dot on I was put. We learned what business we were involved in and why it was so important for Germany that people like Speer, Dönitz or Kleist came to our backwater. This knowledge didn't change anything. We had a different knowledge refusal to work was punishable by immediate arrest and being sent to a special regime camp, or so-called Morilka, where people rarely survived more than 6 months. Rodionov was a living witness to what this special regime was like. Slaves were forced to do what their master demanded of them, regardless of their desires or beliefs. From the very first days of moving to the new camp, many prisoners, taking advantage of the ample opportunities offered by work in the workshops, began to make various trinkets, boxes, caskets, toys, etc. All this was done during working hours, secretly from the German masters, using government material and tools. This activity was illegal and officially prosecuted, but the consumers and buyers of these products were the soldiers themselves and the same craftsmen, and they took part in the conspiracy. What our craftsmen did not do. Port cigars, caskets covered with fine carvings or ornamental patterns made of pieces of colourful straw, figurines, children's toys, models of airplanes and cars, kaleidoscopes, chess, checkers, all made intricately, interestingly, and with great skill. An epidemic of bushcraft took over all the workshops, including the drawing shop, where the art of drawing portraits from photographs brought in by customers, especially flourished. Germans eagerly bought this clandestine production and paid with bread, cheese, cigarettes or tobacco, cookies or homemade products up to and including jam. A real war began between the official representatives of the camp administration and the mass of prisoners. Those caught in the act or red-handed were fined with the loss of a day's wages and their wares confiscated, but the administration was losing the war. The German customers were too well paid to fear punishment by the German supervisors. So the administration gave in. A compromise was adopted that suited all three parties involved in the conflict: the captive craftsmen, the buyers of the goods and the camp administration. In one room of the barracks they set up a workshop for work in their free time, i.e., after work in the workshops and on Sundays, provided the workshop with the necessary tools and appointed a chief, Major Bedritsky, responsible for issuing tools to the masters and for receiving them before closing the workshop. The prisoners undertook not to engage in smuggling work during the working day and not to steal materials, but to obtain it from the hands of the German in charge of the workshop in question, from scraps or leftovers unsuitable for the main production purposes. Everyone was satisfied. This auxiliary production took on such a scale that Fetzer set up a special shop in the German barracks, where visitors could choose and purchase their favorite item. The main currency was bread cards and tobacco products. When enough bread cards were collected, 2 prisoners accompanied by a soldier would go to the bakery in Wolgast and bring with them bread in sacks, which was divided among the sellers according to the price for each item sold. Bread was no longer a rarity in the camp, and on the paths you could sometimes find an unsmoked steer. Hunger, cold, disease, dirt, parasites, rags, and the arbitrary rule of the camp police were all behind us. Podnizy, Zamosk, Biala Podlaska remained in the past as a heavy nightmare. Life in the Wolgast camp was a human life, although the human beings were deprived of the main human attribute, freedom. And if questions of mere animal existence were a thing of the past, questions of human life became more and more important. What are we doing? The morality of our behavior. What can we do today, and how can we prepare for the future? On the night of August 17th to 18th, 1943, an event of world significance took place in the immediate vicinity of our camp that dramatically changed our position as prisoners working for the military needs of the country that had captured us. After 11 o'clock at night, air raid sirens wailed somewhere nearby. The prisoners in the room woke up and waited for the cry of the bitch, as the alarm siren at the camp gate was called. When the bitch gave her voice, the guards immediately opened the doors of the rooms and shouted "Raus, Raus," and we all had to run across the yard and jump into our bomb shelter, i.e., into the trench. The sirens fell silent for a while, and then howled with renewed vigour, joined by the voice of our bitch. As usual, all along the coast anti-aircraft batteries began to work, and the familiar rumble of bomb trucks joined these familiar sounds. Usually this murmur increased gradually, reached a maximum and gradually stopped as the attacking squadrons continued their way further south, towards Berlin, but towards the centre of Germany. This time it was unusual. The bombers were directly above us, and the camp began to be literally covered with small fragments of exploded anti-aircraft shells. Behind the woods flashed searchlights and illuminated clearly descending bombers and accompanying fighters. A few minutes later, the ground shuddered from the explosion of bombs somewhere very close. Peenemünde. There was no doubt, beyond the forest, beyond the strait, at a distance of 5 kilometers from the camp island of Usedom. Peenemünde, 3 waves of bomb trucks at intervals of 10 or 15 minutes dropped a load of bombs on an area of several square kilometers. By 1 a.m., everything calmed down, the alarm sounded, and we returned to the barracks. Everyone had the same thought, kaput Peenemünde. Such a massive attack of many hundreds of bomb carriers, dropping many hundreds of tons of bombs, we had never experienced before. Kaput Peenemünde. The morning rise was at the usual time, but one of the junior non-commissioned officers of the guard was doing the inspection. The camp authorities were nowhere to be seen. And missing from the drawing board were G. Nike, Pellet, the husband-wife Zimmermans, and our Russian engineers. Only a German in a Bavarian hat walked briskly down the passage, sullenly and without his usual smile, and disappeared into his room, closing the doors tightly. During the day, some military and civil servants came and went to the German barracks. Hildenbrandt, Valura, Fetzer appeared, but no one came into the camp. After work, I wanted to go to Fetzer's office to find out something, but the guards would not let me in and ordered me to return to the camp. The unusualness of the previous day, with almost no Germans in the camp, except for a few soldiers who did not want to talk about the results of the night raid, only confirmed that something very serious had happened, the defeat of Peenemünde. The night passed quietly, and in the morning, immediately after the inspection, all but Colonel Ogorinov, Major Antonov, and a few sick in the sanitary room were taken out of town, loaded into large trucks, and taken to the island of Usedom. Before the shipment, Papa Gielenbrandt warned us that we were travelling as prisoners of war, not as prisoners of war, and therefore should be very careful in our display of emotions and reactions to the orders of those who would command us. Everyone there in Peenemünde is in an extremely nervous state right now, he said. He turned out to be right. As soon as our camp convoy handed us over, already on the island, into the hands of another convoy from the ANR military guard, we immediately remembered the fall of 1941 and our memorable march to Leissigary. The soldiers of the convoy, and especially their chief, an elderly, wiry and vicious field officer, did not hesitate to use sticks and rods, with which they were all armed in addition to their carbines. It was not until 2:00 in the afternoon that we arrived at the place of work. On the way we saw the results of the air attack. Whole villages had been completely destroyed, the roads in many places huge craters, the railroad along which we were walking had been put out of service for many weeks. In several places, right on the side of the road, were stacked corpses covered with tarpaulins, waiting to be buried or taken away. There was a direct hit by a bomb on the dormitory of the trade school. Over 70 boys were killed there. We saw their corpses. Already at night, when we returned to our camp in Wolgast, we learned about the overall results of the raid on the night of August 17th to 18th in 3 consecutive raids of the British Air Force. Participated about 600 bomb carriers, dropping at least 2,000 tons of bombs on the targets. The losses of the attackers were 15 or 17 bombers and 5 or 6 fighters. The target of the first raid was the residential settlements of the complex, including work camps. The second wave dropped its load on the production area, and the third wave destroyed all the experimental laboratories and devices. At least 75% of all buildings were reduced to rubble. At least 6,000 people were killed and nearly 2,500 wounded and maimed. For the Allied Air Force, the game was worth the candle. Peenemünde ceased to exist. We were given dry marching rations and ordered to be ready to go in 20 minutes. We were then divided into 4 groups and dispersed to different parts of the affected area. In many places the fires were still burning and fire crews were working there. The group I was in was first led to an almost completely destroyed brick 2-story building, where we stood for about 15 minutes waiting for instructions. But then they moved us to another place, to 2 other low and long barracks-like structures made of corrugated galvanized iron, standing at right angles to each other, with semicircular roofs and lots of pipes of various sizes sticking out in all directions. The bomb hit the ground near where the 2 structures joined, and there everything collapsed. The task was to disconnect all the internal equipment that had failed, broken and destroyed from the whole system and pull it out into the yard. The work was supervised by 3 Germans, the guards in a sparse table chain around these structures. From our general understanding, the facility was some sort of blown air tunnel of small capacity. The work was not too hard or dirty, and the German supervisors were not particularly pushy. Talking among themselves, they sat more than worked. When the prisoners began to dismantle the fallen ceiling on one side, they found the corpse of a dead worker in blue overalls under a pile of collapsed iron platforms and stairways. The corpse was dragged out into the yard, a car arrived, and the dead man was taken away. When asked how many people were killed in the bombing, one of the Germans said that here, no, not many, as there were many well-arranged shelters on this site, but in other places the losses were great. Worked without a break until almost dusk. Everyone was gathered into a column, and 3 other groups came up. A German in civilian clothes appeared, with an armband on the sleeve of his jacket. A white armband with a black swastika on a red circle. Through an interpreter he announced, "Work, you will be here on the island for 3 or 4 days. You will be fed like German soldiers. You will sleep in barracks at the edge of the settlement. There are no shelters there, in case of possible air attacks. If there is an air raid, the guards will open the doors of the barracks right after the first alarm, and you must run to the sea as soon as possible, to the water, and stay there until lights out. After lights out, you must return to the barracks for inspection. If any of you are missed by the guards, the next raid will leave the barracks locked. That's all we can do. There is absolutely no escape from this island. Its entire perimeter is heavily guarded. Understood, of course. Everyone understood the circle of responsibility. One is responsible for all, and all for one. Our team was lucky with the work. but the other two had to participate in the dismantling of completely destroyed buildings, where at the time of the air attack, for some reason, there were many working people. They pulled out from under the ruins corpses, and often only parts of the bodies of the dead, put them into Kleenex bags, not even being sure that everything they put in the bag belonged to the same dead person. Our prisoners who got the job were tired and exhausted to the limit, not so much physically as psychologically. Many even refused to eat, and having washed immediately went to the barracks to sleep. 2 almost new barracks were prepared for us, completely empty. Only fresh straw covered with sailcloth was spread along the walls. The barracks stood at the very edge of the settlement, at a distance of 75 or 100 meters from the sandy shore of the bay. There was no fence around the barracks, no bars on the windows, and the doors were locked from the outside with a simple wooden bolt. The guards, as we estimated, consisting of 37 soldiers, under the command of the same elderly field officer who had brought us here, stood around the barracks at a distance of 30 paces along the perimeter marked by wooden slats placed on the ground, indicating the boundaries of our prison yard, and we were strictly forbidden to cross this boundary. In anticipation of a hard and long day's work, all of us, without waiting for the call to go to bed, went to our barracks and lay down on the straw to sleep. It was still quite dark when the sirens all along the coast howled in a loud chorus, and the guards opened the doors of the barracks with rumbling and shouts and ordered everyone to run to the edge of the sandy beach. There was no need for a second order. Everyone realized that if in our camp in Wolgast we were relatively safe, because the existence of the camp and its location were unknown to those who commanded the air attacks, then here we could be a direct target of bombing. We rushed out of the barracks and rushed to the water's edge, driven by the fleeing guard soldiers. The usual picture of night bombing was unfolding before our eyes. Searchlights cut the dark sky. Anti-aircraft defense painted it. With hundreds of flashes of shrapnel shells, the heavy rumble of bomb trucks, and the peculiar whistling sound of high-speed fighters of air defense. The attack this time was somewhere southeast of Peenemünde. Bedritsky determined that the bombs were dropped at a distance of 30 or 35 kilometers from us. I remembered the general map of Usedom Island, which I had seen more than once at Fetzer's, and we decided that either Schweinmunde or Stettin was being bombed. The bombing was over, but for some reason no signal was given to stand down, and we all continued to stand at the water's edge. It dawned, low rays of the sun illuminated us, standing on the beach, and a dense mass of fog, standing over the sea like a wall, at a distance of half a kilometer from the shore. Quite suddenly, 2 fighter planes flew out of the fog at an almost glancing flight and, firing long machine gun bursts at the crowd, disappeared back into the fog in a westerly direction. There were 2 dead Vasya Chudnov, a kitchen worker, and a mechanic Pyotr Dementyev. 1 soldier from our convoy was badly wounded. We carried our dead comrades to the barracks and lined up in a carriage near their bodies. It was firmly decided, despite the direct danger, not to go to work, but to demand to be sent to the camp. Despite our powerless position, we were convinced that the Germans had gone too far in violating all the rules of prisoner of war detention by forcing us to work under enemy fire. Breakfast arrived, and the commander of our convoy, a field sergeant, ordered us to have breakfast and go to work. Afanasyev, who took command over us, declared to the field febble that we would not go out of formation, would not accept breakfast, but would not go to work, and that we demanded the arrival of a senior officer to whom we would state our grievances. The fieldfehl did not expect such determined resistance. He left quickly and returned 10 minutes later at the head of an additional detachment of soldiers of at least 50 men. The convoy surrounded us, standing still around the bodies of the dead, and the soldiers pointed their guns at us at the fieldfebel's orders. The feldfehl again ordered us to take food and go to work. We refused, continuing our demonstration of protest. As we expected, the fieldfebel did not dare to use his weapon. For about an hour we stood in the same position at gunpoint. Finally a car pulled up and 2 officers and a man in civilian clothes got out. We continued to stand still in formation. Afanasyev repeated our demands and added that we wanted to take the bodies of our comrades with us for burial in accordance with our religious traditions. All 3 of them approached the bodies of the killed and saluted. Then a man in civilian clothes turned to the line of prisoners and in a fairly clear Russian language said, "The command and administration of the ANR expresses its sympathy to you on the death of these two comrades of yours. Now, after breakfast, your entire group will be sent back to Wolgast. You will not work here on the island anymore. You will be provided with a carriage to transport the bodies of the dead. Go to breakfast. In half an hour you'll be on your way back." The demeanour of this superior made a good impression on all of us. Someone said times have changed. Remember the fall of 1941. But now the Germans have done well, correctly, and even beautifully. Wolgast in 1943 is not Biala Podlaska in 1941. Our column moved on. 15 kilometres separating Peenemünde from Wolgast, we passed in 4 hours with 1/2 hour stop. Ahead of us, in step with the marching column, was a wagon with the bodies of the dead wrapped in sailcloth. The convoy, headed by the same elderly field febble, behaved surprisingly calm and even correct. Chudov and Dementiev were buried in the city cemetery next to Gavrilov, who had been buried there earlier and had died of pneumonia in the spring. As then the prayers were read by one of the older prisoners, who in his youth had been a sexton in the village church. The funeral was attended by the whole camp, including Hildenbrandt, Wallura, Fetzer, the Germans in charge of the workshops, and Ginaiki was also present. Over the graves were placed the same oak 8-pointed crosses as over Gavrilov's grave, with the names of the dead carved in Russian. Then Fetzer told me that our steadfastness and organisation had made a great impression in the ANR Directorate. After the defeat of Peenemünde, life in the camp somehow changed. Outwardly everything was the same: inspection in the morning, work in the workshops and drafting, lunch, dinner, toy-making. I worked in Fetzer's office, brigades went to work to the neighbourhood boers. And at the same time, one could feel some confusion and uncertainty in the air on the part of the military leaders of the camp and the NAR administration. Fetzer was sometimes not seen for weeks at a time. The Zimmermann couple disappeared. Their rooms stood empty. The German in the Bavarian hat also rarely appeared. Giannaiki and Pellet became less demanding, and the workload in the drafting room decreased. Now one could often see the prisoners busy reading books from the library rather than working. Giannaiki began to avoid heart-to-heart conversations with me. Only once he said that despite the repeated bombing of Usedom, work continued there. Many workshops are reliably protected from bombs, he said, pointing his finger at the ground. They continue to work, albeit with less intensity. Giannaiki came over to me and put his hands on my shoulders. "Tell you what, Peter, I too will be leaving here soon. After the war, if you and I live until that happy moment, you can find me there in Stuttgart. Then maybe I can really help you. The end of the road is in sight, thank you, Professor." "So what do you see at the end of the road?" I asked. "Don't ask me. I don't see, hear, or know anything. I am so insanely tired of all this madness. Hitler has very little time left, and so he may make very dangerous decisions for the whole world, and especially for the Germans. Only God can be hoped for. The Germans themselves are in a hypnotic trance of National Socialism, and the maestro medium will not let them come out of the trance until the very moment of catastrophe." Yes, the end of the road was approaching, and Hitler had less and less time left. Allied aircraft were destroying German industry systematically and consistently and terrorizing the population, and the air defences were getting weaker by the month. Arms in camp were rarely given. Even when sirens howled in Wolgast, our bitch was usually silent. Winter started early, with cold winds, wet snow and piercing winds from the sea. Giannaiki left, saying a warm farewell to everyone, and in his place was appointed a young lame engineer named Kolsberg. From the military marriage category, Kolsberg was wounded in Africa during the defeat of Rommel, and was no longer suitable for combat service. He was a quiet, silent and uncommunicative man, pedantic and dryly official. Even with Pellet he had only official relations. Christmas and New Year's Eve 1944 were dull. Everyone became gloomy, self-absorbed, preoccupied. It was strictly forbidden to bring German newspapers into the camp, but the very fact of this prohibition spoke volumes. The only source of information was Semyon Vladimirovich. He told me about what was happening at the fronts, and I brought this news to the camp. The Russian newspaper Zarya, which arrived from Stalag every week, was interesting at first, with fresh thoughts and truthful analysis of events, but gradually it turned into a mouthpiece of Nazi propaganda, as it was called in the camp, and almost nobody read it. Shortly after Christmas, 2 representatives of the ROO came to our camp. They were dressed in German officers' uniforms, but without the eagle on their chests, with RAF insignia on their sleeves and pre-revolutionary officers' oval saint. George cockades on their caps. At lunchtime they were led into the dining hall by Papa Hildenbrandt and told that the lunch break would be extended for an hour and a half for an informative speech by Mr. Captain of the Russian Liberation Army. By this time 2 groups had clearly and openly formed in our camp, one sympathetic to the ideas of General Vlasov and the organization of the ROO, and the other openly pro-Soviet. This second group was headed by Captain Pugachev, who, not entirely in jest, was called Partorg. Pugachev was in charge of the shoe and uniform repair shop, and he lived in the graphite workers' room. When the visiting captain of the ROO began his address, Pugachev's group wanted to disrupt his speech, and from there came shouts of traitors. Traitors. Get him out of here, but the usually mild and sort of indecisive Colonel Ogoranov suddenly showed himself as a strong-willed commander. He demanded silence and declared that the speech of the arriving captain of the ROO was informational, that he did not permit any discussions, bickering or obstruction, and that anyone who violated his order would be removed from the hall and deprived of lunch for 2 days. The arriving captain had apparently spoken before such a stratified audience many times before. He spoke smoothly, thoughtfully, without pathos, simply and lucidly. First he told about himself, who he was and how he was captured. Then about the situation at the front in the spring of 1942 and the battles near Rostov, in which he participated, about the prisoner camps in Kishinev, Justikow and Hamelberg. He spoke of the disenfranchisement of the people under the Soviet regime, the terror of the government, the concentration camps, the anti-humanity and utopianism of communism, and much more. I am not going to persuade or convince any of you. I am simply advising you all to think about what has happened to the motherland and what will happen to it if Stalin and his entourage come out of this war, with much help from America, victorious. A situation has now been created, perhaps for the last time for our generation, where we can influence the future of our homeland and change the course of events. We can now take up arms, organize ourselves, and become a force to be reckoned with by any combination of the victors. We have a chance to recreate Russia as a strong state of law, where not only bars from the Kremlin and their satraps can live, but every honest citizen, without lies, without fear, without poverty, and without sycophancy to the man with a party ticket. A state that will take its proper place among the other nations of the world. Then he told about General Vlasov, about his biography and military career, about how and why Vlasov decided to break with communism and Soviet power, about the main points of Vlasov's program. The liberation of the peoples of Russia from the domination of a group of internationalist communists who usurped power in the country. He ended his almost hour-long speech thus. Think over my words, gentlemen. Think about how you lived before the war, how your relatives and friends lived. Think about what awaits you all if, in the event of Stalin's victory, you fall into his hands again. Think about what will happen to our homeland under the further rule of Stalin and the NKVD, Smersh and other Chekist organizations. Think now, while there is still time to think and come to a decision honest to yourself. I or another representative of the ROO will hover over the camp from time to time, and if anyone wants to join us, we can help quickly. Ogoranov invited questions, and the questions sprinkled like from a sack. As might be expected, the questions asked by Pugachev's adherents and followers were often provocative, sarcastic, mocking, and covertly insulting. Colonel Ogoranov was careful to keep the conversation within the bounds of orderliness and formal politeness. If the camp administration had allowed it, it would have dragged on, probably until the evening. The captain of the ROO answered the most pressing questions very skillfully and intelligently. Immediately after the meeting, he and his fellow lieutenant left. Everyone dispersed to the workshops excited, arguing and exchanging impressions. The drawing room was buzzing like a beehive. Everywhere stood clumps of prisoners hotly discussing the event of the day. In fact, this captain had nothing new to say. It was all already known, discussed and negotiated. Each one of them, either loudly in conversation with his comrades or silently, alone, on a bunk or on the floor of a dirty, ragged barrack, had approached these topics in one way or another, remembering his miserable life there, at home, amidst the constant fear of a black crow. Coming to the house, fear of the chief of the special unit, fear of a word of criticism, fear of arrest, working over at a general meeting, and all the other innumerable fears of everyday Soviet life, everyone has many times asked himself the question why. Why is there a vicious circle of fear and lies from which no one can escape? While everyone was living there, boiling in this cauldron of Soviet 5-year plan, over-fulfillment of the plan, Stakhanov's obligations, many people, probably the majority, did not even think about this enchanted circle inside of which everyone was. But when they had an opportunity to look at it all from the outside, when the centrifugal force of events threw them out of the circle, suddenly everything appeared in a new, unexpectedly clear in its meaninglessness form. Yes, why? Why? In the name of what? Now the news was not the meaning of the Rovian's speech, but the very fact of it. For the first time, not in a private conversation between 2 or 3 prisoners of war, but from the pulpit, loudly and authoritatively said exactly what many people were constantly thinking, and not by an ordinary prisoner of war, but by an official representative of an obviously large and quite strong organization. The result of the visit of the ROA representative had an unexpected effect soon. In less than a month, 7 men left the camp to volunteer for the RF. 3 from the locksmith shop, 2 from the electromechanical shop, and 2 from the drafting shop. Interestingly, the youngest military technician of 22 years old, and the oldest, a 54-year-old military engineer, left the drafting room. We, too, spent a great deal of time discussing the ROA officer's presentation. In fact, we were almost completely convinced that this was the only way out for us, but we were not yet ready to take the last decisive step. Fetzer asked me several times when I would sign the application form to voluntarily join the Russian Liberation Army, but I kept my jokes to myself. One day on Hildebrandt's orders, I went to work for our regular customer and consumer of labour force Bauer Frohlich. The job was engineering. This Frohlich wanted to build a new staircase in his house to replace the old one that was almost falling apart. The draftsman was to make the drawings and the carpenter did all the work. I was to take all the measurements and sketch the structure according to the owner's wishes. Frohlich was a rich man, and in addition to our work crews, he had a team of French prisoners and hulking girls from the Ukraine working for him all the time. Some of them I knew. They brought us food when we worked in the fields. Our conversation with Frohlich immediately ran into a language barrier. I did not understand him, and he did not understand me, so Frohlich called one of his girl workers. Semyon Vladimirovich repeatedly told me about this girl named Vera. She was from Kiev, an intelligent teacher, played the piano, knew German well, and according to Semyon, was very good-looking. When she arrived, I had to mentally agree with Semyon's assessment. Vera was really beautiful. With her help, everything went smoothly, and after an hour of work I had taken all the necessary measurements and understood the customer's wishes. Since there was still a lot of time before the arrival of the soldier with whom I had to return to the camp, with the permission of the owner, Vera took me to the kitchen and treated me to a cup of good coffee and homemade cookies. Her story was simple and dramatic. When the Red Army retreated, she stayed in Kiev. I couldn't leave, leaving my children at school. She told me about many things that were completely unknown to me, about the explosion of Kreshchatik with bombs that were set in advance during the retreat of the Soviet troops, about the destruction of the Jewish population in Babi Yar by the Germans, about the Germans' brutal massacres, destroying entire villages for the acts of partisans, about the hard, powerless life during the occupation, and much more. When the Germans retreated, Vera again stayed in Kiev with her children, but immediately after the Red Army entered the city, she was arrested as a fascist collaborator and ended up in prison. Her idealistic attitude to her duties, the duties of a public school teacher, was not rewarded, but severely punished. I didn't quite understand how, but with the help of a doctor I knew, who had also been arrested for continuing to work as a district doctor under the Germans, she managed to escape, first from prison, and then through the front to the Germans. She and the doctor got a place on a German sanitary train to go to Germany, but the doctor died of a heart attack, and Vera ended up in the Ostministerium, and as a hulk ended up here with Frolik. At Frolik, she soon began to work as a sort of senior housekeeper and managed the entire household. The owner of the house was bedridden, and the owner's daughter was in the last months of pregnancy and in a very serious mental state. Her husband had been killed on the Russian front. What Vera told us about the extermination of the Jews in Kiev reminded us of the first months of captivity, the rounding up of people of Jewish origin in the camps, the outrageous attitude of the Germans toward the civilian population in Poland, and the outbreak of Judeophobia among the prisoners. Obviously completely isolated from life outside the camp, we had no idea of all that was really going on. The newspapers wrote very little and vaguely about it. Our Zarya did not touch on the Jewish question at all, so we, especially those who intended to use the doors of the rower to get behind the wire before the final events of the war, began to gather information from all available sources about what the general policy of the German government on the Jewish question was, and of course, how this question was treated in the rower and among the leaders of the movement for the liberation of Russia. I tried talking about it with the Germans in the camp, but they all simply did not want to talk about the subject. Fetzer told me that the Germans believe that Jews in general are a malignant nation, that there is no place for this ethnic group in a future free Europe, and that Jews will be isolated one way or another. Semyon Vladimirovich didn't know much either, but he said that a huge number of the Jewish population in Germany and the occupied territories were imprisoned in concentration camps, and that the living conditions there were terrible, with a very high mortality rate. Representatives of the rower who came to visit us confirmed this. As for the policy of the liberation movement on the Jewish question, the same captain who came to our camp after Christmas said, "We are not going to copy the Germans in this matter." The several million Jewish population in the USSR is as much an ethnic group in the general mass as the Kalmyks, the Ukrainians, Tatars, Poles, etc. They are full members of the multinational community of peoples inhabiting the USSR, and will remain so when the USSR is replaced by the Russia for which we are fighting. Colonel Ogarinov fell ill and was taken to a Stalag hospital. From there he did not return, but enlisted as a volunteer in the rower. By spring at least 15 people had left our camp to join the rower. Both Russian rocket engineers disappeared, but Semyon Vladimirovich continued to live in the camp. He did not work much. He said that Peenemünde was completely deserted, and that all the main workers of the Na had gone to some new places in the centre of Germany. In our camp, too, the work was at a complete standstill. They were very intensively carried out only in the graphite workshop, where people were added at the expense of the locksmiths' and electricians' workshops. Sometimes even 2 shifts worked there. The production of toys flourished and expanded. Fetzer organized sales of products to the Stalag and our masters. Began to receive food from Red Cross parcels as payment. Fetzer explained that the Stalag had a stock of these parcels, confiscated by the German administration from those prisoners who for some crimes fell into the position of penalized, all within the framework of the Geneva Convention. We, of course, were not against it. Let the French be fined, and the Germans pay us for the toys with their parcels. American cigarettes, canned goods, dried fruit, and even chocolate appeared in the camp. Fetzer, apparently also nothing to do, he went home on vacation, brought home gifts and gave me a whole jar of strawberry jam. All day long he read or hung around the camp, and when I sometimes worked in his room in the evenings, he started endless arguments with me on all sorts of subjects, except, however, the ANR, the situation at the fronts, and the future of Germany. These subjects were taboo. One day he said that, with the permission of his superiors, starting next Sunday he would organize walks for groups of prisoners in the nearby woods, and suggested that Antonov and I, who had become Russian commandant after Colonel Ogarinov's departure, make lists of these walk groups. Sunday hikes into the woods became very popular. The group marched with an escort of 6 soldiers, under the command of Fetzer, who usually had a revolver strapped to his belt. They marched in formation, with songs. Several cosy glades were chosen. The soldiers of the convoy sat down on the perimeter, and in the glade frolicked prisoners. They read while lying on the grass, played chess, checkers or cards, organized games, soccer, town, checkers, and generally enjoyed freedom. In general, we were now quite well informed about what was going on at the fronts. Anglo-American forces approached Rome. The Red Army liberated the Crimea and gradually squeezed the Germans out of Finland. Soviet divisions were on the borders of Poland. The Americans began to beat the Japanese. All this information came to us late, but still came. But when the Anglo-American forces under the overall command of American General Eisenhower landed on the shores of Normandy on June 6th, we learned about it on the same day. The Germans were excited and said it would be a second Dunkirk, but now none of those who had landed would be able to leave. Then the Führer took pity on them. Now they would all be destroyed without regret. Fetzer went somewhere, and I went to work in his office on purpose, in the hope that I could talk to Semyon and learn a little more. Semyon said that the Allies had thrown a huge force into this operation, deceiving the vigilance of the German defences, and that he thought it was unlikely to be a Dunkirk. As it happened, the Allies gained a foothold on the coast of France, and despite desperate German resistance, began to expand the territory they had captured. Fetzer arrived gloomy as a cloud. To my innocent questions, "How are you?" "What's new?" he bellowed fiercely. "Don't play dumb. You know what happened. So shut up and don't gloat." But on June 19th, 2 weeks after the Allied landings, a German newspaper, in large letters on the front page, reported Germany has begun to use weapons of retaliation. High-powered rocket shells, the Fa-1, from the mainland bombarded London, causing great destruction. England is in panic. The war has taken a turn. Now Germany has a terrible weapon and will take revenge on the British and Americans for the destruction of our cities and the killing of many tens of thousands of civilians. The hour of retribution has come. First England and then America will pay for their crimes. Numbers of this newspaper the Germans willingly gave us. Fetzer was a birthday boy. I told you, it's too early to write Germany off. The fact that those Italian pasta makers screwed us up doesn't mean anything. Germany is now back on her horse and holding the sword, he said with pathos in the blueprint. Germany is a historic place where geniuses of art and science are born. Wernher von Braun is one of them. We quickly concluded von Braun is nah, and we are part of it, and especially now when the parts for this weapon of retaliation, the Fa-1, are being manufactured in the graphite workshop. The conclusion was unpleasant and disturbing, but it was the one the whole camp was talking about. The Germans were cheating, brazenly and ugly. There were 300 prisoners of war living here, so there was no danger of Allied air attacks, and the Germans here, by the hands of prisoners, were making parts for their weapons of retaliation. Again and again the old question was raised how to react. And can we react at all? After the bombing in Peenemünde we had easily achieved satisfaction of our demands and even earned the respect of the administration. But there the demands were of a different order, and the circumstances were conducive to our victory here in the camp. In our safe and cosy corner, we had only two possibilities: either to make an open protest, to refuse to work, fully understanding the consequences, or to continue slavishly following the instructions of our master, the ANR, and the Wehrmacht. The first was deadly dangerous. The instigators and organizers would have been shot, and the rest would have ended up in special regime camps. The second was organically repugnant. Besides, after the division into pro-Soviet and anti-Soviet, it would probably have been impossible to organize common actions. We anti-Soviets knew very well that Pugachev had already drawn up a blacklist, and that this list would, of course, be handed over to the first representatives of the organs who would appear here at the end of the war. For many people, volunteering for the Roa, liberation from the slave camp of the ANR, joining a large, strong organization defending our national interests, whose goals and objectives we sympathized with, and participating as much as possible in the achievement of these goals, became the only way out. To stay in the camp was tantamount to signing one's own death warrant. But not everyone thought so. In the first days of August, several cars drove up to the camp, and out of them came 3 SS officers, 2 men in civilian clothes, and a dozen soldiers with machine guns. After a short time, all the prisoners were ordered to line up in the middle of the courtyard, and the visiting soldiers, together with our regular guards, surrounded the formation. Clearly something serious had happened. Perplexed and agitated, we stood in formation for about 15 minutes, and then a whole procession appeared from the German barracks, with all 5 newcomers with Fetzer and Hildenbrandt in the lead, followed by Almost. all the Germans permanently employed at the camp. The 5 newcomers, Fetzer, Hildenbrandt, the master of the graphite shop, Purichner, and his deputy from the second shift, the lame old man Stiegelburn, went into the graphite shop and did not come out for a long time. We continued to stand in line, lost in speculation. At last all the Germans came out of the workshop. Purichner and Stiegelburn were led away by 2 soldiers to the German barracks. Hildenbrandt, obviously excited, all red, called out of the ranks Senior Lieutenant Zvezdilov, the foreman of the graphite crew, and 3 others. Right in front of the formation, the visiting Germans and Fetzer started beating these 4 men, and when we raised a ruckus, Hildenbrandt ordered the soldiers to point their guns at our formation. Antonov stepped out of the formation and said something to Hildenbrandt. In response, the latter took his pistol out of his holster and hoarsely ordered Antonov to return to his seat. The beating of the graphite workers was brutal. They were beaten with their fists, revolver handles, and carbine butts. Those who fell were kicked. It was quite clear that this beating in front of the line was not only a punishment for the guilty, but also a warning to all the others. All 4 of them, bloodied and barely standing on their feet, were handcuffed with steel handcuffs and dragged toward the enemy. Fetzer took off his gloves, which he had put on before beginning the execution, and, still breathing heavily, said, addressing us, "These 4 have been found guilty of an act of sabotage. They will be executed. All return to their workplaces. Everyone working in the graphite workshop, stay where you are." When we returned, Kolmberg, who had been head of the drawing shop after Prof. Janicki's departure, called everyone together and said, "During the last week I have discovered errors in some of the drawings which a competent draftsman can only make deliberately. This is also sabotage. I will intensify the inspection, and you beware. See that some of you do not find yourselves in the position of your comrades from the graphite room." That day I was to work at Fetzer's in the evening, but I decided not to go. I did not want to meet Fetzer, who had taken a direct part in the beating of the graphite workers. But after supper a soldier came in with orders from Fetzer to report for work at once to his office. "Sit down and work. The statements must be sent tomorrow to the office. I will not tolerate sabotage on your part either, Mr. Major," angrily he said to me, and left the room. I finished my work, folded the papers, and was about to call a soldier to return to the camp, but Fetzer entered. "Sit down," he said. "Do you know what has happened? What these 4 men have been found guilty of?" "No. So I'll tell you, they deliberately added double the amount of calcium salt to the graphite mass before moulding. As a result, the stabilizers were too brittle and some of them broke in transit. Since this was quite unusual, they analyzed it and found an increased presence of calcium in the mass. And if these idiots had added calcium more carefully, say 10 to 15%, the stabilizers would have been installed, and when the rocket projectile was fired, immediately. Upon changing the angle of ascent, the projectile would have fallen to the ground and exploded in the immediate vicinity of the launch site. Do you realize what would have happened? The very principle of Germany's main weapon would have been called into question. It would have taken weeks, maybe months, to find the actual cause of the disaster. I know you all resent the scene of punishment in front of the formation, but I am sure that if you were in my place, under the proper circumstances, when caught red-handed, the saboteurs who have done great harm to the cause to which you are personally devoted in body and soul, and you might lose your cool and impulsively use physical force against the rogue saboteurs, I replied. Perhaps, of course. But I probably wouldn't put the gloves on impulsively before a beating. With Fetzer, relations soured badly. The next day I, Bedritsky, Lyashenko, Melnikov, and 5 others wrote applications to volunteer for the Russian Liberation Army. Alexander Rodionov, a member of our small group, did not want to follow our example. I don't think it's the right move. I'm not sure Vlasov has worthy aims. I have no way with the Germans, under any circumstances. I must still consider how to proceed. When Fetzer learned that I was going to the Roa, he said to me, "I hope that if you and I meet outside the camp environment, we can maintain friendly relations and not turn into enemies." August in our camp was eventful. 3 days after the incident in the graphite room, the Germans arrested the head of the room, where the graphite workers lived, Partog Captain Pugachev and Dr. Andriusha, as we called the paramedic in charge of the first aid station and the hospital room. Antonov said that the arrest was made on the basis of data obtained during the interrogation of Zvezdilov and 3 of his comrades who had been beaten and taken away. On the night from Saturday to Sunday of the same week, there was again an escape from the camp. 2 graphite workers escaped from room No. 12, where Pugachev lived. The room was half empty. There were only 10 people living there, and after Pugachev's arrest there were 8 left. This happened in the following way. The barrack stood on supports, and the distance from the floor to the ground under the barrack was sufficient for a person to crawl through. Each room had a vestibule in which there was a parashah. The floor of the barrack was of 1 board, and to strengthen it was padded from below with a thick layer of a mixture of paper, sawdust, and shavings pressed into large sheets. The fugitives removed 2 narrow floorboards in the vestibule, cut them with something very sharp, cut through the layer of reinforcement, and crawled to the wire. There, as in the escape from the drawing room, they cut the bottom row of wire and took off toward Wolgast. The 2 fugitives, young clappers, spoke German pretty well. Both were Odessians and great pals. It was interesting and mysterious whether they ran away in the same underwear, or whether they had clothes stashed away somewhere. All their uniforms, including their shoes, they had left behind. It had rained heavily since the evening, and a thunderstorm had played out during the night. Any footprints they might have left were washed away by the rain. The guards, both inside and outside the camp, were hiding somewhere from the rain. The conditions were perfect for a daring escape. The fugitives were not caught. The commotion in the German administration was great. Von Brunte arrived, with him some other officers and civil servants. The remaining 6 were interrogated for a whole day, and some of them were beaten up. Then all 6 of them were put in the punishment cell for a week. The punishment cell has been used for its intended purpose very rarely in the camp so far. A couple of times the residents were put there for 1 or 2 days as punishment for minor offences, stealing from the workshop, disobeying the foreman, or other such violations of camp discipline. Now 6 people were squeezed into the small room, measuring 2 by 3 meters. No matter how much these unfortunates swore that they had seen and heard nothing, no matter how much they proved to the Germans interrogating them that the mere fact that they had not run away, but remained in the room, testified to their innocence, they were punished, and punished very severely. 6 people in a small concrete sack, with an iron roof and a narrow window over the concrete floor, at a temperature outside of 40 degrees Celsius. Inside the punishment cell the temperature was much higher. The unfortunate prisoners were literally suffocating in their confinement. They told me later that they took turns lying down on the floor, pressing their faces against the slit under the door to catch their breath. The regime was very strict. They were fed twice a day, in the morning a mug of ersatz coffee and a tiny piece of bread, and at noon 3/4 liter of soup. That was it. They took them to the restroom early in the morning, even before the rising signal, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and again at 7:30 in the evening. The rest of the time they steamed in a concrete cauldron, suffocating from the heat and their own fumes. The floor of the punishment cell was completely wet with their sweat. They were not even given extra water. A sentry stood in front of the door of the punishment cell all day and night, and when they were taken to the restroom, the soldiers inspected it beforehand and did not let anyone get close to it. The question immediately arose how to organize any transfer of food and, most importantly, water to the prisoners. The most diverse, often fantastic proposals were debated and immediately rejected for impracticability. On the second day, as I sat in my room to draft, a brilliant idea occurred to me: a latrine. During lunch, I discussed my proposal with Antonov and others. The proposal was accepted immediately, and all the details of carrying it out were worked out. In the evening of the same day, the prisoners received their first transfer of food and water. The scheme I proposed was simple, convenient, and quite feasible. The latrine was a long single-pitched structure with a door at the end. On the left side there was a full-length elevated chest of drawers with 12 glasses, and on the right side there was a sloping chute. Several hooks were screwed in under the locker of the last point, which was forbidden to be used, and food bags and water kettles were hung from them. This was done as close as possible to the time when the prisoners visited the latrine, so that the gear would not be soaked by the stench. When everything had been decided and the food had been served, the prisoners were informed. As they were walking to the latrine, the bath attendant cleaning the corridor between the punishment cell and the bathhouse said, "Look under the last point." Those understood. With the first transmission was an instruction written on a piece of paper: all packaging and empty dishes hang back on the hooks, so that nothing can be seen from the outside. This system worked without fail for the entire week of the sit-in. When the arrested were released, they said that only the morning gear, which had been on the hooks under the wheelhouse all night, had failed badly. Nothing. Prisoners have eaten such things. Thanks. 5 sat out the whole term. Only one of them was let out after 3 days. He passed out from the heat. When everything was over, in a conversation with Antonov, my father marveled at the endurance of the Russian soldier in such difficult conditions. With the disappearance of Pugachev from the camp, the councillors seemed to quiet down, but not for long. They quickly found their successors. Too quickly the Germans were retreating in the east. The front was near Warsaw. My relations with Feter had frozen. He sometimes tried to bring them back to more friendly, but every time I remembered his calmly angry face, squinted eyes and gloves, which he pulled on his hands before beating Zvezdilov and his comrades, and he withdrew. The Sunday walks continued, however. The graphite workshop was suddenly closed. 3 trucks with trailers arrived. All the equipment was dismantled, loaded onto cars and taken out of the camp. The electrical workshop was running at a quarter load in the drawing room reading books. The camp had obviously lost its importance. It was far away from the ANR Directorate, which had moved somewhere new. The population of the camp had also decreased considerably. Now, by mid-August, there were less than 200 people left. Arrests, escapes, and the departure of volunteers to the ROO made the proportion of pro-Soviets in the camp increase, and in parallel, the relations with the camp administration deteriorated. The prisoners became more arrogant, disobedient, if I may put it this way, more aggressive, and therefore the administration became more picky, harsh and less inclined to various manifestations of humanity. Probably the Germans themselves did not know what to do with this small and now meaningless camp of Soviet engineer prisoners of war. Rodionov, who did not want to go free through the doors of the rower, together with us, quite unexpectedly, was the first of us to be free, using quite different doors. Alexander Pavlovich was an exceptionally nice, intelligent and pleasant man, a knowledgeable and experienced engineer, but the only thing military about him was his appearance. Large, strong, physically handsome blonde, he was gentle, soft, indecisive and sentimental, like a young lady institute. And of course his refusal to join us was mainly based on his dislike of all military things. Everyone in the camp treated him very well, including the councillors when I thought about him and the approaching end. I was sure that he would sit until that end and perish somewhere in the Siberian camps, which are probably already being prepared for our brother traitors and traitors who dared to break their oath and surrender alive. One day Semyon came to me in my workroom in the drafting room and told me that some German woman, young and beautiful, not exactly an acquaintance, not exactly a distant relative, had come to see Frolik, and that she was very interested in Rodionov. And her name was Elsa, and she spoke Russian without any accent. That's how it began. When I chose the moment to tell Alexander about it, he almost fainted from surprise. It turned out that this was the same cousin, who had bailed him out of captivity in Riga, and then facilitated his transfer from the special regime camp on the island of Rügen to us, in Wolgast. And the most interesting thing was that she was not his cousin at all, but his wife, not married, not registered, but his wife. The purpose of her coming to Wolgast soon became clear. She wanted to steal her Alec, as she called him, from captivity. The seeming absurdity of this lady's desire soon turned into an almost 100% chance of success. When Semyon, who often met Elsa in the house of Frolik, where his unmarried wife Shura also lived and worked, told me in detail the escape plan Elsa had worked out, I was struck by its simplicity, its almost complete safety, and its unconditional attainability. According to this plan, on one of the next Sundays during a walk in the forest, Elsa would be waiting with a car and a faithful man, the chauffeur, in a certain place on the road, passing near one of our favourite glades, and hidden from view by a thicket of tall bushes. Rodionov will need only a few minutes to get out through the thicket to the road unnoticed by Feter and the soldiers of the guard. This must be done at least 45 minutes before the end of our walk. Thus, when Rodionov's disappearance is discovered, he will already be at a distance of 35 to 40 kilometers from Wolgast, on his way to the estate of Aunt Elsa, located somewhere in Württemberg. In the truck loaded with carrots, Rodionov has already made a camouflaged hiding place for him to stay during the journey. If by the time Rodionov reached the road, Elsie's truck was not there for some reason, Alex should return to the clearing in peace. Success depended only on precise coordination of actions mine and Rodionov's in the camp and during the walk, and Elsa's and her drivers on the road in the forest. Only 4 people, and Rodionov himself, were to know about the escape and its preparation. In the camp, me and Semyon, and on the outside Elsa and her trusted chauffeur. Semyon and I liked the plan, and we enthusiastically agreed to assist in its realization. This plan had the main things that could ensure success: outside help, fast and reliable transportation, and a place where the fugitive could be hidden indefinitely. When I told Rodionov himself about the forthcoming kidnapping of the captive Rodionov, he at first resolutely refused for fear of failure and subsequent return to the special regime camp. The memory of almost a year's stay in such a camp left a deep trace in Alexander's psyche. It took a lot of effort to finally get his consent to the realization of Elsa's plan. At his inertness, which he himself recognized, he would certainly, at the end of the story, would be in the hands of the NKVD, and then he would be forever separated from Elsa, whom he apparently loved very much, and would die in Soviet prisons. My entreaties and proofs, Elsa's frequent notes brought to him by Semyon, succeeded. The escape was set for the last Sunday in August. It turned out that the circle of conspirators had widened. Elsa had initiated Vera into her plan. They had become friends from the very first days of Elsa's stay at Frolich's. For Semyon and me, the whole story of Rodionov's escape became a challenge to the Germans in general, and to Feter in particular. To steal one of the prisoners from under Fetzer's nose, and to steal it so that no trace of it remained, was extremely tempting, especially as the risk, after all, was not great. On the day of the escape, I was to ensure that Rodionov was in the group of walkers, at a certain moment to give a sign to Rodionov, and when he moved to the bushes separating the clearing from the road, to organize a diversion, and distract the general attention, including Feter and the soldiers of the guard. For the diversion, I decided to sacrifice for a couple of days my friendly relations with Bedritsky and to cause an explosion of his temperament. I, of course, was very worried when finally after lunch the command sounded, "Everyone who is on a walk, go to the gate." We went out, lined up in a column of 2 people. As usual, in front went Feter and me. In order to come to the right clearing, I immediately started some very philosophical argument with Feter, knowing that he would get into excitement, would not pay attention to the road, and in fact the whole group would be led by me. Everything turned out exactly according to the plan thought out and memorized. At exactly the appointed time, Rodionov came to the bushes, went a little deeper into the thicket, pretending that he was fulfilling his natural needs, and then began to break branches with leaves brightly coloured in autumn colours and put them in a bouquet. This moment was determined to be exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. According to the experience of previous walks, at this time, an hour and a half before the end of the walk, everyone usually rested, having played various games, and most just slept, collapsed on the grass. Feter was always asleep at this time. The escorts were also dozing, sitting in their seats. I heard the double honking of a car on the road. Invisible from the clearing, it was nothing unusual, as cars sometimes travelled along the road from Wolgast to the fishing village on the bay. A double honk indicated that Elsa and her car were waiting. I rose from my seat. Rodionov's head disappeared into the bushes. 2 steps, and I, as if by accident, stepped on the arm of the sleeping Bedritsky. When he indignantly swore, I did not apologize, but on the contrary scolded him. The enraged Bedritsky rushed at me with fists. I took a defensive position. To prevent a fight, everyone jumped up from their seats and rushed to separate us. From the road came the noise of a passing car. In the heat of the scandal, no one paid attention to it. Woke up Fetzer calmed Bedritsky and me, reproaching us for lack of restraint. I apologized to Bedritsky, but he pouted and laid down on the grass again. So did I. At 4.30 Fetzer commanded formation. Rodionov had disappeared. At first we thought he had fallen asleep in the bushes, began to look for him, then some suggested that maybe he was sick. Rodionov, according to the plan, imitated unwell for several days in a row. Everyone was perplexed. No one could assume that the soft, indecisive, often lethargic and apathetic Sasha Rodionov had run away. Some speculated that maybe Rodionov himself had returned to the camp. He was certainly not in camp. All our group was locked up in one room immediately after arrival, and almost until morning they were summoned for interrogation one by one. In the dining room there was a whole commission headed by an SS officer who had arrived urgently from Peenemünde. Some were released after interrogation to the living quarters, others were interrogated several times. That night I was summoned for interrogation 3 times. The story of Rodionov's disappearance was the main topic of conversation for several weeks. Now Rodionov was endowed with some special qualities. He seemed to many people now cunning, secretive, duplicitous in his own mind. They remembered that at work at Bauer he talked to Polish workers. It came to the point that they began to suspect in him an agent, some NKVD agent, and others Gestapo agent. Fetzer simply fell ill. He, of course, received the strongest reprimand from his superiors, and obviously on instructions from above, the camp tightened the screws. Payment for our work stopped, so my work in Fetzer's office also stopped. Work crews continued to work at the neighborhood bars, with a much stronger escort and a categorical prohibition of any contact with the civilian population. However, the manufacture and sale of toys continued even more intensively than before, as the amount of work in the workshops decreased and decreased. In general, the case of Rodionov's escape was somehow quickly hushed up. It was too unpleasant for Fetzer, Hildenbrandt, and probably many in Peenemünde. But Fetzer himself continued the search in the hope of finding at least some tip of the thread to untangle the whole knot. As it turned out, he went around all the owners who had our prisoners working for them, interrogated the owners and workers, checked their testimonies and studied their answers. He simply said to me, "I intuitively feel that you know more about the story with Rodionov than you say. It was not without your participation. Everything was done cleverly, so far not a single trace, not the slightest hint. But if I find even the slightest clue, the smallest crack in this conspiracy, you, Major, will be bad. Very badly, I promise you." Perhaps he would have found something. He himself had suffered too much in this whole Rodionov affair, but subsequent events deprived him of this opportunity. Semyon Vladimirovich was transferred somewhere else to another job. He married his friend Shura and left. Vera, a teacher from Kiev, married a French prisoner, a certain Nicola, who, having fallen in love with her, signed a declaration of loyalty to the government in Vichy in order to be released. After the marriage had been arranged, they left Wolgast. Thus, of all the participants in the conspiracy, only I alone remained in Wolgast. And in the last days of September, quite suddenly, with great haste, our whole camp was evacuated. In the morning everyone was raised on alarm, ordered to pack up, put equipment and tools in all still working workshops, and by the end of the day all the personnel were loaded on a large barge, and by the next morning we were in the harbour of Greifswald. Sleep-deprived, hungry and perplexed by the sudden evacuation of the camp, we were led along the outskirts of the town to Stalag and housed in 3 wooden standard 3-room barracks. Immediately upon arrival we were given breakfast, which resembled Hummelberg in quantity and quality. Next to our barracks, separated by a barbed wire fence, were barracks inhabited by prisoners of war Italians, former German allies and now enemies. The Italians, who only 2 years ago had fought with the Germans against the Red Army in the Ukraine, were now greeting their former enemies, the Russians, with loud shouts and warm applause. We were allowed to rest until lunchtime, and almost everyone took the opportunity to go to bed. After lunch, also not enough to feel satiety, our old acquaintance Andrei Kuzmik Novikov appeared. He said that he did not know why the camp had been evacuated so urgently and so suddenly. He had some assumptions, but not sufficiently thorough to speak of them. He also reported that Granov, and with him and 9 others, had left the rower and their Russian group. Now consisted of only 23 men, and that he himself had been appointed to take Granov's place in the Stalag chancellery. The Pomeranian autumn had begun. It was raining, a cold, penetrating wind from the sea was blowing. We sat in the barracks, languishing from boredom, idleness and uncertainty. Once a representative of the ROO, a young lieutenant who had graduated from the propaganda school and was somewhere near Berlin in Dabendorf, came to see us. He told us, who had applied to join the ROO, that the matter had been delayed because of complete chaos in the ANR administration. I told Bedritsky and Lyashenko about my role in Rodionov's disappearance. This was a surprise to Lyashenko, but Bedritsky was not surprised. I suspected something, too. This rudeness was not like you when the rain stopped pouring. Our Italian neighbours would crawl out of their barracks and instantly put on a concert. They sang in chorus, sang duets, performed soloists, and we were amazed at the abundance of beautiful voices and applauded after each number. The food was somewhat improved, besides which we received transmissions from the French and Belgians. They were stationed on the other side of the Stalag, but knew about our group and always sent us greetings through Novikov, who continued to have friendly relations with them. This was pleasant and often profitable. We stayed in the Stalag for 3 weeks. Just as suddenly as the evacuation from Wolgast, the prisoners were brought back. At the evening inspection, our Papa Hildebrandt suddenly appeared and announced with a cheerful smile that in the morning everyone was going nach Haus Zurich. Nach Wolgast, his words were greeted with a real prolonged ovation. Pops was smiling like a birthday boy. Indeed, for many of us, the camp at Wolgast had become home ... the only home. In the morning, after breakfast, our entire convoy went to the main yard of the Stalag, where tarpaulin-covered trucks and an escort unit headed by Hildebrandt were waiting. Just as 2 years ago, on the day of the arrival of our small group of engineers from Hammelburg, it was raining, and a large red flag with a white circle and a black swastika was wetly streaking under the gusts of wind on the mast. Before the loading began, another of our old acquaintances, Sonderführer Zeichelmann, appeared and called me Bedritsky, Lyashenko, Melnikov and 3 other men out of the ranks. We were taken inside the administration building, placed in a large room and informed that we were all authorized to join the Russian liberation army and that from that moment on we were no longer prisoners. Zeichelmann made a whole speech in which he expressed his pleasure that we were now comrades in arms and said that he hoped that soon we would be able to return to our families and people as victors and liberators of our country. Then he added that we should leave for this very Labendorf with a 1.30 train and that we would be escorted by 2 soldiers and 1 non-commissioned officer. This is not a convoy, it is for your convenience and safety, for you do not know the road, the language, and are dressed strangely for an independent journey. Zeichelmann took away our number cards, and I was no longer PAL 7172. So we had crossed the line. Everyone sat in silence, and each in his own way, though with a great deal of commonality, experienced this moment. Until that day we had all been Soviet citizens, loyal or not, adherents of the Bolshevik system or oppositionists, shouting hurrah to Comrade Stalin or only opening our mouths for camouflage. But we had all been Soviet, and now we had become soldiers of the new Russian army, anti-Soviet allied, for the purpose of overthrowing communist power to Hitler, with Hitler against Stalin. And there is, and can be no return to the past. For this moment I like, of course. Others had been preparing myself for the whole of the last year, but still, when the moment came, it was necessary to live it. The choice had been made, and the consequences of the choice were more than unclear. In fact, we who had declared our voluntary desire to join the ROO knew very little about the size and strength of this organization, about the actual framework of relations between Vlasov's headquarters and the German command, and about many other things that determine the position of an officer in a Russian army organized in the territory of the enemy Soviet Russia for the purpose of overthrowing its government. One intelligent and good man who worked in the drafting office, upon learning of my decision to go to the ROE, said to me, "One must be driven to the point of despair to consciously make a choice between an external enemy and an internal enemy in favor of the external one. I personally cannot do this, although I know what I will have to endure if I live to the moment when I again find myself in the hands of the internal enemy. For myself, I decided otherwise. We, in our little friendly group, had long ago come to the conviction that for the Russian liberation movement, hence for the Roa and for us as well, there could be only two variants of the finale in this whole world drama. The first, the Germans will be able to suspend the Red Army offensive for a time sufficient to organize and arm a dozen Roa divisions, and their appearance at the front will turn the war between Germany and the USSR into an internal civil war. The right propaganda of ideas and the right policy of the Roa in contact with the Red Army units and the population should have provided a decisive turn of events and lead the country to liberation from the yoke of communism. Fears that Hitler's Germany would be the dominant force in shaping Russian life after the fall of the Soviet system seemed ridiculously ridiculous to us. Simply from a comparison of the size of the territory and population of these two countries, that if we take the concept of Russia in geographical terms, the second variant of the end with the defeat of Germany, a strong, organized, armed, cohesive and anti-communist Russian army became a natural ally of the Western democracies in their future struggle against Soviet totalitarianism. Such a post-war war seemed to us quite inevitable. Everything we knew about the political systems of Great Britain, and especially the United States, ruled out the possibility of post-war compromises between Stalin on the one hand and Roosevelt and Churchill on the other. The unnatural alliance of capitalist democracies with communist absolutism in our understanding was simply forced, purely military and only a tactical device. At that time, at the end of 1944, we not only did not envisage the third option, but also did not suppose its possibility. We knew nothing about the Tehran Conference. The Yalta Conference had not yet taken place, and nothing foreshadowed the future capitulation of the leaders of the West to the tyrant of the East, with the transfer of half of Europe into his power and the extradition to death of millions of anti-communists. One way or another, we had chosen our path, embarked on it, and could now only follow it to whatever end. At 1:30 in the afternoon, our seven, two very old soldiers and a lame young non-commissioned officer were placed in a compartment of a wagon and drove to Berlin. To the Roa. To our escorts we continued to be mere prisoners. Even to the restroom one of the soldiers escorted us. All three of them were frowning, tired, preoccupied and silent, and in this they did not differ from other Germans. In the mass of the people, too, the smiles and laughter had disappeared. Everyone spoke with serious faces, in a low voice. I remembered how one Italian prisoner, who had been on the Russian front in 1942 and was now sitting behind the wire in Stalag Greifswald, told me all Europe hates Germans, Hitler, Nazism and all of Germany. Germans know this and understand the reasons for this hatred. But the fear of the coming wave of communism is also shared by almost all European peoples. We were supposed to arrive at Labendorf by 7 o'clock in the evening, but on the way the train was stopped twice because of air raid alarms. We arrived at the gate of the Roa camp, through the dark streets of the small town, illuminated by blue lamps in deep caps, after 10 o'clock. We were received at the gatehouse by the officer on duty and taken to the kitchen, where we were given dinner, and then the whole group was taken to a half-empty room in the barracks and offered to rest. The officer who met us said that we were free until morning, and that in the morning, after breakfast, we should go through the reception committee, receive our allowances, uniforms and assignments. During breakfast in the common dining room, our group, standing out among the masses with its still captive garb, did not attract much attention. It was a common phenomenon here. More and more former prisoners of war and Roa volunteers were arriving. I learned that Ogarinov and Granov were working at Vlasov's headquarters, and that others from our camp in Wolgast had already been assigned to the 1st and 2nd divisions. We were also told that on July 20th there was an attempt on Hitler's life, but it was unsuccessful. He got off with a few scratches and a fright, but here in Dabendorf there was panic, because the connection between the group of German officers who organized the assassination attempt and those who promoted the ideas of the Roa was suspected at the top. Vlasov himself and General Trukhin, the camp commander at Dabendorf, were hidden somewhere for the time being until the storm subsided. After breakfast we returned to the barracks, where we spent the night, and all except me and Lyashenko were immediately summoned for procedures. After a while, an officer, with the epaulettes of a major on his shoulders, middle-aged and trim, came to our room. He introduced himself as Major Pszeniczny and said an unpleasant complication has occurred with your enlistment in the RAF. Gentlemen, at the request of the organization for which you are enlisted, what is it called? Hier ist Peenemünde, or something. The Wehrmacht has revoked its permit. And you must return to your place of work today. Does this apply to our whole group? I asked. No, just the two of you, replied Pszeniczny. Why and how this happened, Major Pszeniczny did not know. Last night, even before our group arrived, a dispatch was received from the Wehrmacht concerning only me and Lyashenko. It was a great blow to us. Why just the two of us? Major Pszeniczny said that in the morning it was reported to the head of the school, General Trukhin, and the latter gave the order to send us back to the NAR. He explained, enrollment of prisoners in the RAF takes place only when the Wehrmacht removes them from the category of prisoners of war, and until that happens, you are outside the jurisdiction of the RAF, and we here, including General Trukhin and even Vlasov himself, are absolutely powerless to do anything about it. We asked for an appointment with General Trukhin, and in half an hour he received us. Wheat led us to a separate small barrack. It was a large room, furnished with cabinet furniture, with a large desk in the middle. As soon as we had time to look around, General Trukhin entered. Tall, thin, very pleasant-looking, he was obviously embarrassed by the occasion and his own impotence. We stood up and saluted. The general shook hands with us. Please be seated, gentlemen, he said in a soft, chesty voice. I know your whole story. It is very unpleasant to me, but I cannot help you radically at this minute. I will at once take steps to have you both released from captivity, as soon as possible, and enlisted in the rower, but now you will have to go back to your camp. Mr. General. I exclaimed, this is an unheard of mockery. It is, I know all that, Major. I know what you have to say, and, without listening to you, I agree to everything in advance. But, I repeat, you will have to put up with it and go back. For a short time. I promise you both that I will achieve and, after a rather long pause, he added, believe me, I understand your condition, and all the bitterness of resentment, and all the rage for your unceremonious, callous and rude treatment. But understand mine. It may be even more bitter. I, the general and chief of this whole institution, have no right to tell them to leave you alone. Goodbye. I hope it will soon be different, and we will speak differently, and they will be forced to listen to us. It's very hard for me to say this. You both have to go back to the POW camp. I give you my word that I will not rest until you and I meet again in this room, under happier circumstances for you and for me. Goodbye, Mr. Officers. Leaving a note addressed to Bedritsky, we found ourselves again on the train, accompanied by the same lame undersecretary who had brought us to Dubendorf. Only now, sitting in the compartment of the train and calming down, we fully realized what a puddle we had fallen into. Back to Wolgast. To the camp, where now there were only the undecideds, passive and frightened by the impending denouement, and a close-knit group of pro-Sovietists in the camp. We would find ourselves in a foolish position, and would be the target of ridicule and bullying. Somehow we had to avoid all this. But first of all we must understand the reason why the ANR blocked our departure to the rower. If it concerned only me alone, the reason. For the ANR's objections could have been that I was a petty officer of a drafting unit that was still in operation, but the fact that Lyashenko was in the same position confused the cards. He was a rank-and-file draftsman, and there were 15 men like him who had already left for the rower. Besides, the foreman of the carpenter's shop, Captain Boyko, and Colonel Ogarinov, our Russian commandant, were released from captivity to the rower without delay or complications. We decided that this was simply a bureaucratic error in the ANR Chancellery, without any serious basis. Departing from this assumption, we decided to act upon our arrival in Wolgast to make a great scandal and demand our sending to Stalag, where we would wait for clarification of the situation and the results of General Trukhin's actions. We came to the camp from Wolgast station about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. All the prisoners were at work. We were met by the familiar soldiers of the guard and led into the office by a smiling and satisfied Papa Hildenbrandt, who greeted us with a Nach Haus on our return. Fetzer also appeared, also with a smile on his face, and with the caustic remark, "That's it." The number failed, but when we told our camp authorities that we would not go to the camp, and that if they wanted to send us there, they should beat us senseless and take our bodies there, the smiles disappeared from their faces. It was quite clear that both of them were confused. They tried to reason with us, to frighten us with reprisals and punishments, with the punishment cell, with special regime camps. But we stood firmly on our own. We would not go alive, and they would have to drag us to the camp if we were insensitive. Outraged and irritated by our desperate and determined resistance, Giddenbrandt and Fetzer ordered us to be locked up in one of the rooms of the German barracks. We ourselves were in a state close to hysteria, and sat locked up almost silently for more than 2 hours, waiting for the results of our revolution, but we came out victorious. At about 6 o'clock in the evening a car came from the Stalag, and we were taken to Greifswald. In parting, Fetzer said, "Damn you, where in Russia you have such lunatics. In the Stalag you'll be put in jail and a kutuska." I really hope so. But we were not put in the kutuska. Instead, we were led to an empty barrack. We found ourselves in a room with 16 empty beds, a couple of tables and a dozen chairs, and a row of standard individual lockers against the wall. And not a single person. A German soldier brought us dry evening rations, a decent jug of coffee, and locked us up until morning. Our barracks was in the block where Serbian prisoners lived. In the morning at 7:30 a non-commissioned officer came and said that we would receive our rations in the neighbouring barracks where the Serbs lived. Relations with the Serbs quickly improved. This group had been in captivity since the beginning of the war, and had settled in very well. They all received Red Cross parcels, and their camp rations were not fully utilised, so Lyashenko and I could eat as much as we wanted. But as for the Red Cross delicacies, the Serb brothers were stingy and rarely offered treats. They were generally rather primitive people, little interested in what was going on outside their little world, and spent their time in a kind of ball game or in endless quarrels and swearing among themselves, but rather unkindly. A non-commissioned officer who came to see us in the morning turned out to be the chief of the Serbian bloc. He said that after lunch he would come for us and take us to the Sonderführer at the Stalag office. And indeed, after 1 o'clock the non-commissioner appeared again and took us to the very office where all our 7 rower volunteers had only 2 days before received congratulations on the occasion of their release from captivity and the beginning of their careers in the army of General Vlasov. We were met by Zeichelmann. In a long, very rambling speech he apologized for the misunderstanding and justified it. But it is all absolutely nothing. For a short while you will both stay in the Stalag while the paperwork is finalized, and you will go to your assignments. Absolutely sure. But you will wait a few days, and so you won't be bored. You'll be helping me with the library of Russian books. It will be absolutely interesting for you. The word absolutely was obviously a favorite word in the Sonderführer's vocabulary. It was absolutely interesting. There was nothing to help. Zeichelmann gave us no work. We were absolutely free and read. There were quite a few books, and many were unknown. For the first time in my life I began to read the Bible. Then I read white emigre literature translated from German magazines, freshly published political pamphlets of the Roa and German propaganda publications in Russian. The fame of the 2 Russian officers who had agreed to collaborate with the Germans spread quickly through the camp. The Serbs, in whose block we lived with Lyashenko, were rather indifferent to it, but the French and Belgians reacted much more sharply. The way from the Serb block to Zeichelmann's office was along the fence, enclosing the part of the camp where the French and Belgian prisoners lived, and every time Lyashenko and I passed by, we were insulted and scolded. It was always very unpleasant. In all probability, the French were told about us by Russian prisoners working in the camp chancellery and maintaining very friendly relations with the Franco-Belgian bloc, not without mercantile interests. Now the clerks were very reserved towards us. And here the German defeat in the war was approaching. The pole of power had shifted compared to the time when in 1942 a group of draughtsmen stopped here for a few days on their way to Wolgast. Things were different then. Then it was still Heil Hitler, now it was Long Live Stalin. Lyashenko perceived this hostility of the French and Belgians very painfully. He even sometimes stopped at the fence, trying to explain the situation. Come on, Igor Petrovich. They will not understand our motives. I calmed him. They are people from another planet. For all these boys, everything is very simple. The Germans are their enemies. The defeat of the Germans is the victory of their countries. It is the return of each of them home, to the familiar life, to familiar conditions, to loved ones, to everything that they love, respect and appreciate. For us, the victory of our country is the triumph of Stalin and all that we hate. For us it is shame, possible death, and great grief for all our loved ones. And just for opening our mouths and daring to say that we disagree with Stalin. To these nice Frenchmen and Flemishmen, we are traitors, collaborators and traitors. We are splinters. We are against their military ally, the Red Army, whose successes they applaud, and this they can neither understand nor forgive us. We are against Stalin, and therefore, ridiculous as it may seem, we are listed as enemies of Roosevelt and Churchill, along with all the Germans. We know that we are also against Hitler. They don't know it and can't understand it. In fact, we are their most loyal and faithful allies, but they will find that out much later. Yes, we're the splinters. And back in the camp of the perishing Lyashenko agreed.